In this lecture, we're going to carry forward the idea of diffusion and apply it to people when we look at migration and immigration. And the image on the screen right now shows you a number of different neighborhoods in Los Angeles. These neighborhoods reflect a couple things. One, different waves of immigration when groups arrived in the United States from other countries. And two, a very important topic to both this lecture and this course, the impact on our cultural landscape and the evolution of a transnational landscape that is triggered by new groups arriving in an established area. When we look at population movement, we ask ourselves a couple questions. Why are people moving? And the reason why people move is generally governed by push and pull factors, and also barriers to diffusion. Why is someone leaving an area? Why is someone attracted to an area? And the barriers to diffusion or the barriers to migration would be those intervening obstacles that people may face. This graphic simplifies the idea of push-pull and barriers to diffusion or barriers to migration. Some of our extreme push-pull factors would include refugees. Generally, refugees are experiencing these extreme push factors, whether it be war, natural disaster, or other types of occurrences that cause people to leave their homeland, generally against their will. When we look at the impacts of people moving or the long-term effects, we need to recognize that our culture and our cultural landscape change as people move. And when people move, they integrate, they meet, they assimilate with an existing group, and what we have is the evolution of polyculturalism, syncretism, an idea that we've discussed already, through the interaction, the adoption, the change of these different groups coming together. Some examples of polyculturalism or culture that collides is religion, food, dress. Again, the way we complete our tasks, the way we interact, the way that we go about our lives changes and evolves as different groups with different cultures come together. The image on your screen is a photo from what many of you consider Uptown Towson, York Road just south of the traffic circle. And we could see this polyculturalism or this syncretism that's evolved in a smaller town or small city just like Towson. You could see on the left side of the image we have a Vietnamese restaurant. In the center, we have a Chinese-influenced tea shop, Kung Fu Tea. And then to the right, we have the Kent Lounge, an Irish-themed bar and restaurant that reflects an older wave of migration. So the left side of the screen with the Vietnamese restaurant, the center with Kung Fu Tea, they reflect more modern waves of immigration, whereas the Kent Lounge on the right reflects an older wave of immigration coming from Western Europe. When we discuss migration, what we're looking at is a permanent move. So we're not talking about students attending class at Towson or another school for 3 months or for half of the year and then going back to their hometown. We're looking at the idea that you relocated your permanent address for at least 1 year. So tourists, seasonal workers, students are generally falling outside of this definition of migration. That doesn't mean that students currently attending Towson will stay in the area permanently, but the intended move to attend class at Towson generally doesn't correspond with a permanent move. The difference between migration and immigration is simply where are you going? Immigration requires the crossing over of an international boundary. So if we move from state to state within the United States, that would be referred to as migration. If we cross a national boundary and we move to Canada or we move to Mexico or we move to Saudi Arabia, that would be considered immigration. The types of migration that we generally recognize, one is rural to urban migration. And as we get into the waves of immigration that impacted the United States, we'll see how urban areas have long been pull factors. So urban areas since about the mid 1800s have represented opportunity, work, new lives. Rural areas, as we'll see, have represented population decline for generations. Right now in our developing world, our emerging countries, also known as less developed countries, we see that urban areas are booming because of this rural to urban migration. In many of our developing and emerging countries, urban areas provide not only opportunity, but in many cases limited or the only opportunity for a large part of the population. When we see this rapid migration and we see rapid growth in certain areas at the expense of others, this creates a situation called cumulative causation. And cumulative causation reflects growth in an area that triggers further growth, whereas an area that is losing population will go into further decline. So as we see people moving around, as we see people pursuing those pull factors, the opportunity in our urban areas, we see our rural areas go into decline, not only losing population, but also losing talent, also losing economic opportunity. The other type of migration that we study is urban to urban migration. And in countries that are highly urbanized, countries like the United States, we see what's called a metro redistribution as people move from one metro area to another. Right now in the United States, we're seeing the metro areas in our Northeast and Great Lakes region are growing at a slower rate, and some are actually declining relative to our metro areas in the Sun Belt. So cities like Nashville, cities like Atlanta, cities like Austin, Texas, those areas are gaining as metro areas like Baltimore are declining or growing at a lower rate. So this metro redistribution looks at the permanent movement of people from one metro area to another. And we also study suburbanization. So within our cities, within our individual metro areas, we recognize that our suburban areas outside of the city limits are growing faster than our downtown or our urban areas in many cases. The image on your screen is a favela in Rio de Janeiro, and favelas in Brazil are growing at a rapid rate. And the growth of favelas reflects rural to urban migration. This migration has gone on for about 50 to 60 years, and we're seeing that people are moving into cities much faster than cities can accommodate the growth. When we look at urbanization later this term, we'll revisit this idea of favelas. We'll revisit this idea of informal housing and informal neighborhoods that emerges in countries where rural to urban migration is happening at such a fast pace that the city and the market cannot accommodate the growth. The image on your screen now is a black and white photo of Sparrows Point from the mid-1900s. Sparrows Point was the largest steel producer in the United States, employing over 30,000 people and having what's called a multiplier effect on the local economy, meaning there was hundreds of businesses and employees that supported the activities going on at Sparrows Point. Sparrows Point had a very slow death in the late 20th and early 21st century. Employment declined, production declined, to the point where Sparrows Point shut its doors. When you have 30,000 employees and all of the supporting businesses go under, you see people looking for jobs and pursuing opportunities in other areas. Sparrows Point reflects a region of the United States referred to as the Rust Belt. And Rust Belt population has declined for a number of years. Really, we're looking at a time period going back to the 1970s. And as industries like Sparrows Point, steel production, heavy industry close, these people are forced to migrate elsewhere in order to find new opportunities. Here's an image of Sparrows Point in the early 21st century, right before the remaining mill was removed. Sparrows Point has been recreated and reimagined as what's called Trade Point Atlantic, an area of shipping and distribution. Companies like FedEx, companies like Under Armour, different rail and road distributors are now arriving in Trade Point Atlantic to connect with the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast. But the economy of the 20th century, the steelmaking industry is gone. When we put together this idea of cumulative causation, we see that in-migration leads to population growth. Again, there's a pull factor of opportunity. As your population grows, people generate more demand. So think about people coming into an area. Newly arrived workers, they're going to need somewhere to live. They're going to need somewhere to shop for the necessities. Maybe if they have kids, they need to look for schools. They also need simple things like haircuts. They need a dry cleaner. They need ways to meet not only their needs, but also use disposable income for recreational purposes. So this increased demand from a new population also leads to more employment in other industries. So areas that are seeing population growth through new opportunities, that leads to additional growth. It snowballs in a positive way. On the other end, areas that are experiencing outmigration see a population decline. And as people are leaving, many times again, they're leaving because of economic decline, job loss, the demand for goods and services declines. And when demand for goods and services decline, we see overall employment decline as other businesses begin to close their doors. So you think about all of those employees at Sparrows Point and where they would spend their money. Many of those people lost their jobs. They're no longer going to their local barber. They're no longer going to their local grocery store. They're no longer taking clothes to their local dry cleaner. They're moving. They're taking their kids out of school. So this cumulative causation refers to growth begets growth, or growth equals growth. So areas that are growing are going to continue to grow and prosper, where areas that are in decline are losing people. They're losing economic viability, and they're also losing their youngest, most talented people. And that refers to this idea of a brain drain. When your population declines and your young, talented workforce goes elsewhere, you lose economically and you also lose overall talent. When we ask ourselves, how can we predict who is going to move? We look at this idea of migration selectivity. And there are generally 4 factors that indicate who, why, and where in the migration process. You can see the image here on the right shows us the rate of migration by age. And you can see right in the middle of the screen, the area 24 to about 34. We see that likelihood rise. And ask yourself, why is that? Why are people moving between the ages of 18 and 30? Usually begins with going to school. Many of you go out of town, out of state to attend college or university. And what one move does is trigger the likelihood of a second move. So while that initial movement to attend a college or university may not be considered migration because it's not permanent, that ability to move for part of the year and readjust and acclimate yourself to a new place, meeting new people, that also triggers the likelihood that you will move again. So between the ages of 18 and 30, you're pursuing an education, you're pursuing a career, you might be traveling, exploring new ideas, taking advantages of opportunities that you may not have later in life, when many of you will have a family, many of you will have a job, or you may have a partner who also has a job, you may own a home. So jobs, homes, children, these factors limit our ability to move in the future. We also see how education impacts the likelihood you will migrate. The higher education you achieve equals the more likely you are to move, and also means the more likely you will move a greater distance. So think about how a higher education will open up more opportunities, not just opportunities in your backyard or your local area, but also opportunities out of state, perhaps opportunities overseas or in another country. Distance decay suggests that we are less likely to move farther away. So many of you attending Towson today are from the Mid-Atlantic, maybe from the Northeast. You are more likely to move within the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast, even if that means you're moving to DC or New Jersey or New York or Philadelphia or Virginia. You're less likely to move to California. That doesn't mean you won't do it. It just means that fewer graduates from Towson, from this area, are going to move to California, and more of our graduates will move within the region, even though you might be moving out of state. And the final idea is this idea of migration streams. So we establish these flows of people back and forth. So you are more likely to move to an area that is established with Towson University graduates, perhaps Washington, D.C., New York City. So we create these networks that make migration easier. It makes you more comfortable in your new setting, and it also makes it easier to move back and forth between, say, Towson and New York City, or Towson and Washington, D.C. So migration streams, as more and more people create and recreate the same migration flow, it makes moving among that stream easier.